All right. So thank you, Grace, for joining me. I'm going to take just a few minutes, kind of walk through a little bit of our conversation, talk a little bit about the project and all this, remind anybody that's watching kind of what we're doing and why we're talking, and then kind of why I may be talking to you. So, what I'm trying to do here is the school district of Clayton. I'll talk about this a little bit later. What we've been looking at is what do we want from our graduates? What are we actually trying to do to prepare them, not just to be great at school, but thinking about the things that they may need as they head out of our district and into life. And for many of our students, part of that is looking at universities and colleges where they may be attending. And it becomes one of the things that's a common conversation here, which is, how do we get students ready for school? Are we doing the right things to get them so that when they want to apply and get into universities that we've got them set up so they can do all of those things? Right or wrong, and I would say there's probably some issues with this, but sometimes it gets viewed almost as a checklist of getting people ready to go to college. And so inevitably it is something that we, even as elementary school people, we start to hear about and start to consider and have to start thinking about, because people see it as you got to make sure they're taking in the right pathway and getting them ready for middle school and high school, which inevitably leads to college. So as I was kind of thinking through different people I could talk to, I thought it would be interesting to talk to somebody from, a highly selective university, and thinking through some of the admissions processes and some of the things that might be myths, some of the things that may be a little bit wrong,
A lot of myths.
some of the things that maybe we can do just to think about from a systemic lens. What are some of the things we could start to look at to kind of add some of that? So that's my long-winded introduction, but first I was going to see just a second if you could just tell us a little bit about you, some of your background, a little bit of a sense of kind of what you do now.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm happy to be here, happy to bust some myths. And I'm Grace Chapin-James. I'm the executive director of admissions at Washington University in St. Louis, just down the street. And I've been working at WashU since this summer. I moved here to University City in July, and previously to working at WashU, I was the director of admissions for the MBA program at the University of Chicago. And part of that had also worked in college admissions at the University of Chicago and at Harvard Law School in the admissions office. So my experience is really working mostly at very selective schools. But if you had asked me when I was in high school if I was destined to be here, the answer would have been no way. I went to a public high school. I grew up in Spokane, Washington, on the border of Washington and Idaho. And so public education is very important to me and was a really incredible factor for me in my growth as a student and moving towards college. But I know that it is very possible to achieve kind of what I've achieved and to be able to be part of the school communities that I've been a part of, without having to worry too much about the college side super early on. I do sometimes joke with my friends that I've got a lot of friends that have little babies, and so I'll often give them a onesie when their babies are born with a note that says never too early to start thinking about college. But that's a joke. I want to make that very clear. Sometimes it is too early, but I'm really glad that as we've chatted, that you and your school district are really starting to think about, like, how do we just educate students and help them to become generally successful and kind of engaged in their learning, rather than what are the boxes to check for college, because there's just really not. We don't apply that philosophy as we review candidates, and I think it's really important that we help students and families step back from that too. So
As you talk about philosophy and like boxes to check, it makes me think, some of this is about my job, but some of it also is, some of it's selfish and personal. Is that, I have a senior in high school as well. And as we've been kind of looking through some of the college processes, it isn't like a checklist. They don't just give you the
right.
check things. They keep mentioning this phrase that is the holistic admissions process. Can you describe just a little bit when you talk about a holistic process, kind of like when someone says, what exactly does that mean? How do you define that?
Yeah, I think a lot of people think we have like mystical crystals somewhere or whatever, but we really are basically a holistic admission process means that we take a look at every single thing that a student shares with us as part of their application, and that contributes to our whole understanding of them as a student, as a candidate for our school. So while there are schools in the world that admit students just on the basis of GPAs and test scores, we don't do that. And most highly selective colleges, in fact, the vast majority of highly selective colleges are not able to do that just based on the size and strength of our applicant pools. If we admitted students with the top testing, this is sort of a stat from when I worked at the University of Chicago, but if we had admitted students with the top 10% of testing nationally, we would have had a class of about 20,000 people, right? And that's just, we had 1,800 spots. And so when we're thinking about holistic review, we're taking into consideration, of course, we are taking into consideration the student's academic record, and we want to make sure that that student has done well and is academically successful and ready to continue that success in school. We're also, if the student shares testing, going to take a look at that SAT or ACT testing, but that is, many schools are moving away from requiring the SAT or the ACT, so it's now the student's choice about whether or not that is going to be part of their application. We take a look at extracurricular activities that they've been involved in, but again, it's not we don't just count them up, right? Or like check. It's really more as part of the narrative of who is this student, how have they gotten involved in their community, what interests them, what kind of skills or assets or drive outside of the classroom do we think that they're going to bring to our community. We take a look at their writing, generally for a couple different reasons to see, is a student functionally writing at the college level or ready to be at the college level? But also, do they have engaging things to say? Are they self-reflective? Are they comfortable, taking what can sometimes be a relatively basic or sometimes a little opaque prompt and expanding that in, it's not always the most creative or, it's earth-shattering way, but some students really can lean into that and help to show us where their voice is and have felt comfortable establishing that voice. We look at recommendations from teachers who talk a lot with us about how that student engages inside of the classroom. Is the student collaborative? Is the student a star but knows it? Is the student somebody who, is a little bit quieter, but when they have something to say, it's really well thought out, and when they raise their hand, it's going to be a game changer in terms of classroom conversation. None of those things would be an absolute yes or disqualifying thing, but those are the kinds of pieces of information that we get from recommendations from teachers. And then generally, we also take a look to see how the student understands their path. Different schools will approach this very differently, but at WashU, for example, we have undergraduate divisions and students will apply directly to those divisions. So engineering, business, arts and sciences, art and architecture. And so we're also looking for a bit of self-reflection that the student has taken some time to understand what interests them and what drives them. And while I don't necessarily need somebody like at age 17 to have, their 40-year plan mapped out through retirement for how they're going to work as a mechanical engineer, I do need to know that, if they're applying into engineering, they have a solid sense of what they're getting themselves into, what this work will entail, and kind of that this path makes sense for them. So there's that kind of self-reflection that it's important for a student to be ready to do approaching the college process too. So we're taking all of that together, and fitting all of our analyses into a class that for us also has about 1,800 new people a year and is going to balance a wide range of different identities, different backgrounds, different states and countries, in addition to all of these pieces that we're looking at within the individual student to help us understand, is the student ready to be academically successful? Is the student going to contribute to the community? And does the path that the student has chosen make sense for them? And does it seem like they're going to enjoy doing that here with us at WashU?
So, I mean, as I'm listening to you, what I'm hearing is it feels like it's what we would say is like whole child, right? Like,
Yeah, exactly.
like, as you're hitting on so much of what is actually in our profile. Like, you're talking about students who know who they are. So that's like what we say would be like self-actualized. You talk about kids who are curious and want to know how they can contribute and intellectually curious. And that's one of our other pieces. You talked about creativity and communication and collaboration and, and knowing. And then you even kind of talked about being comfortable with people who aren't, a diverse environment and having all of these kinds of things. So like so much of that is what we talk about in our profile. But so like as I'm thinking through that, I'm also wondering, I just know as we hear this, there's still so many people that are going to look at this and say, okay, yeah. But at the end of the day, it's really still about test scores and GPA. Like, so that's really still like, all that sounds great and all of it can sound kind of nice. And if I can work that into something, that's great. But at the end of the day, this is what it's about. So if someone comes to you and says that, like, kind of what advice do you give them?
I have worked at some of the most highly selective schools in the country, and the number of students who have perfect GPAs and test scores who are not admitted is not necessarily going to like shock anyone, because those students tend to be doing very, very well, but it doesn't make it a slam dunk, right? If a student has only focused on testing, has only focused on their transcript, we are looking for students who have been successful in those realms. So I don't want to minimize them entirely. But on the other hand, if I am looking at a student who has a perfect SAT score, for example, but really has not found ways to be involved in their community, doesn't understand kind of what their goals or motivations look like in college, doesn't have a sense that they'll be a good community member, doesn't have teachers who speak about how engaged they are in their classroom experiences, that they're a positive contributor, that they elevate the classroom discourse, that student is not a student that's going to be particularly exciting, because again, these are living and learning communities, right? These college communities are places where students need to be ready to be independent. They need to be ready to advocate for themselves and for their goals. They need to be ready to continue to refine those goals, understand the obstacles may come in their way, feel comfortable navigating those obstacles. We don't spend 100% of our time in class in college. And so, having ways that they'll become active outside of school is really important. And so, while I don't think I never want to totally minimize the transcript and the testing rate, because they're a factor, but that's not the only thing. And if a student or a family, I think, feels pressured to, make that so perfect that the rest of the person and their experience is ignored, it's not going to lead to great outcomes, not just in the college admission experience, but also in the idea of that personal development that happens through college, right? The kids that walk around with a little flag that says I got a 1600 on the SAT on a college campus are not usually most people's friend. So being ready to reflect, yeah, that's not a flag, right? Red flag. Pulling back and being ready to be like a human and engaged in the community, and finding some ways to do that, and to be a community contributor, somebody who thinks positively, and again is sort of that self-actualized student is really important. So
I know you've kind of, my next to last question was going to kind of be about, like, do you feel like what we're talking about and what you're doing there, there's some meshing between that? And it sounds like there definitely is. So what I'm going to switch to a little bit here is just if you could go, and if somebody, say a K-12 education person such as myself, came to you and said, what would you like? How do we start to think about this as a system? What could we be doing to help you or to help the universities? Like, what might you want to see from us? Like, that would make this, like, you would see that streamlined kind of, it would feel more streamlined, I guess.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that a lot of the things that you're talking about with kind of those like pillars and values that are really important to how you're educating students just continue to get more and more important as the student continues their growth, right? I think that like one of the, as you think, I am really glad that there are amazing educators who are focused at that early or sort of earlier childhood development and earlier childhood education, that start to think about like ways that like make sense for the student's life stage for them to continue growing, right? And so, I don't think it's a great idea if somebody gets to college but doesn't know how to tie their shoes or share or other kinds of things. And I know that's like relatively simplistic, but it really doesn't matter to me at the end of the day if a student that is not ready to engage in that social and community environment has a perfect test score, right? It's really helping them to sit back and reflect on what do they like, what do they not like, how do they like to learn, what's their style, what works best for them, how do they ask questions, how do they ask for help, how do they find value in subjects that might not necessarily strike them as their favorite, but are still going to be important for them to learn. And I think that just does wonders for students' ability to be adaptable and successful in college, when college is not the first time that they are experiencing something that is hard, or that they're experiencing something that they don't like, or they have a requirement that may not be their favorite, but it's important for them to take seriously. So I just think I really appreciate your partnership in helping like students craft that like liberal arts mindset almost, even as a much younger person, while also being able to focus on some of those really important stages of development that really benefit a student when they get to college. But I think sometimes we can forget about being really important at the elementary level, and missing them at the elementary level being pretty detrimental to a college experience. So
So really, my last question is the same question, and some of it also is selfish because as I'm, I like to hear what different people are learning and thinking about. So, what is something that you might be currently reading, watching, listening to, or just learning about that you would recommend that everybody check out?
oh, that's a good one. I just moved and I moved into an old house. And this is going to sound, I feel like I'm like an 80-year-old now, but I've been watching a lot and reading a lot of resources from This Old House on PBS. And I am like really realizing that like, I kind of wish somebody would have taught me how to like, I know how to change a light bulb, but like, I don't know how to like replace a faucet or, change a light fixture. So I'm getting that education for myself now. And I'm kind of realizing that, yeah, maybe skipping the home ec or the shop class was a bad idea in high school now that, it's either on me or hiring someone. So thank you, This Old House. Thank you, PBS, public television, for giving me a lot of those resources. It's a really good show. I thought it was going to be really like old man boring, but it's actually really, really engaging. So that's, I could pick a more intellectual thing, but that's really where my mind is right now.
It's right there with a lot of what we're talking about. That, yeah, those pieces are always going to be the center of what we do, but it's those other skills that sometimes make a big difference. So,
Yeah, calculus not helping me a whole lot right now. So
all right. Well, thank you, Grace. And again, this is Grace Chapin James, and she's the executive director of admissions at WashU. And I just thank you for taking a few minutes to talk to me.
thank you very much, Patrick, for engaging me in this conversation.